Hello, everyone. Welcome to session number 2. This is titled Stories and Histories of Plants and Humans. This is the second session of the Mind of Plants Symposium. And we have 9 speakers on this topic. And if you're interested in the speakers' bios and background, you can just click their profile and learn more about them. And the speakers' names are in alphabetical order by first name. So we have Estela Calderon on corn, Prue Gibson on hornwort, Kathleen Gutierrez on toad lily, Craig Holdridge on bloodroot, Joella Jacobs on rose, Megan Kaminsky on big blue stem, Megan Jupatina on sunflower, Andre Paris on bean, and finally Stephen White on Seba. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Just a brief reminder, we'll give each speaker 5 minutes, and then we'll just give you a cue after 5 minutes so that we stay on track. For the viewers, you can type your questions into the comments box on the Arts Front platform there, and then I will read your comments, your questions to the speakers at the end of the session. Okay, I think that's all I have to say. So welcome everyone, and I'd like to begin with Estela Calderon on corn. So Estela, when you're ready, please. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello everybody. I will do my reading in my first language is Spanish. Okay. Bueno, como decía, en el maíz, aquí tengo toda una colección de diferentes granos y especies de maíz. Ahora que la población mundial siente los embates del COVID-19, un nuevo virus que ha desatado miedo, enfermedad, encierro y muerte, puedo afirmar que mis días son más llevaderos si me conecto a la niña que fui y en donde el cultivo de maíz era una parte medular en mi familia. Es como si tan indispensable planta en la cultura amerindia de la cual yo provengo haya dejado conectada a su mente a la mía por medio de mis recuerdos. A mediados de mayo, cuando empezaban a cantar las chicharras, mi abuelito Felipe con los mozos subían a las huertas a hacer labranza para preparar la tierra. Eliminaban con machetes la maleza que crecía con las primeras lluvias. Luego el arado jalado por bueyes rompía la tierra que recibiría los granos que dejarían caer entre los surcos y que taparían con los pies descalzos. Era como una danza de personas avanzando en línea horizontal sembrando maíz. Me resultaba todo un acontecimiento ver cada año cómo la tierra se tapizaba de verde, con la germinación de cada planta al salir su primera hoja puntiaguda. Esa hoja me parecía como una alargada oreja, que lo primero que hacía era escuchar los diferentes sonidos y voces del mundo al que llegaba. Con esa idea yo estaba convencida que también cada una de las plantas podría escuchar, hablarme a mí, gritar, reír, cantar, de la misma manera como yo escuchaba en aquella huerta los pájaros o el silbido de mi abuelito o las bromas de los mozos. Cuando la segunda hoja nacía, era como si la alargada oreja la recibiera un fuerte abrazo que duraba hasta el otro día, que se separaban y quedaban como en posición de 2 brazos abiertos, moviéndose cada vez más hacia arriba, hasta llegar a la estatura que yo esperaba durante semanas. El momento que más esperaba era cuando las matas traspasaban mi estatura y yo entonces podía correr en medio de cada surco como viajar entre túneles frescos. Puedo cerrar los ojos y sentir todavía la manera cariñosa y juguetona con que aquellos ásperos brazos de cada planta me tocaba la cara. Yo cantaba debajo de ellas, convencida de que me escuchaban, porque yo podía intuir también la alegría de ellos al verme. No todas se movían de la misma manera cuando las tocaba el viento. Mi corazón podía sentir que los movimientos y sonidos eran mayores en el surco donde yo corría. Esas plantas eran mis amigas, eran momentos que me gustaba compartir con ellas. Terminaba sudada y cansada, como una sensación de júbilo que pocas veces he sentido siendo adulta. Cuando el maíz espigaba, una gran cantidad de mariposas y abejas visitaban los campos. La llegada de los elotes o maíz tierno atraía también a zanates, pijules y chocollos que armaban una enorme algarabía al llegar a robar algunos granos cuando atravesaban con sus picos las capas cubiertas que cubrían a los elotes. Era también una fiesta para todos mis primos y primas, tíos y tíos, que nos reuníamos en la finca Santa Ana a compartir de una deliciosa elotada, regalada por mis abuelitos a toda su descendencia. La elotada consistía en preparar muchas comidas con maíz, el maíz blanco, amarillo, morado, convertidos en atol duro, en guirilas, en tamales simples y rellenos, en elotes asados y cocidos. Todo el día compartiendo comidas y juegos. El ciclo de la siembra y la cosecha dura entre 3 y 4 meses. Las actividades finales son la doblada, la tapizca y la desgranada. El maíz que describo aquí como parte de mi niñez es muy importante por lo que es, pero también lo es por lo que no es. Precisamente el maíz transgénico. Las semillas transgénicas que algunos consideran más robustas, con más valor nutricional, que poseen mayor resistencia a las sequías y los insectos perjudiciales que el maíz no transgénico, despiertan, sin embargo, muchas inquietudes y algunas preguntas. ¿Existen preocupaciones de salud potencial cuando los científicos cambian la estructura del maíz de manera que no ocurra a través del desarrollo natural? ¿Será que el predominio global del maíz transgénico va a crear una dependencia de los agricultores de los países en vías de desarrollo en las compañías multinacionales de semillas que poseen patentes exclusivas de estos organismos genéticamente modificados? ¿Los cambios en el polen del maíz transgénico tendrán un efecto en el desarrollo del maíz no transgénico por medio de la polinización no planificada? ¿Es posible que los genes modificados introducidos a las plantas silvestres causen al final una disminución en la biodiversidad? Estos asuntos y otros definitivamente merecen más estudio e investigación científica. Y para finalizar, quiero decir que en mi vida cotidiana el maíz representa un punto de partida y regreso a las imágenes de mis ancestros. Es tan importante como mi ombligo y el de mis hermanos que mi madre depositara en la tierra de su pequeña finca. Ella decidió que ahí debíamos de nacer sus 8 hijos, con la asistencia de una partera cuyo nombre era Margarita. Yo soy la menor. Los ombligos que nos unían a ella como una raíz que nos alimentaba. Ella los regresó a la tierra para alimentarnos de una madre más grande. Mi madre me dejó plantada como un grano de maíz, amando los espacios que conocí desde que estaba en su vientre. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Estela, on corn. We're so much looking forward to your essay in our book. So our next speaker is Prue Gibson on Hornwort. So when you are ready, Prue, please start.
Thanks, John. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the floor of a house on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge those ancestors, past, present, and future. And while I'm at it, I'd really like to acknowledge my good friend, Monica Gagliano, because as an academic in the field of environmental aesthetics and critical plant studies, her work with plant behavior and communication has been significantly important and influential on everything that I do. So thank you, Monica. So the little ugly hornwort is the plant that I want to talk about today. And unlike many of you who I think have come across or met your plants in your gardens or in the bush or the scrub, I met my plant on a conveyor belt that was being digitally photographed as part of the New South Wales Herbarium process of digitizing their 1.4 million specimen collection. And this little ugly hornwort was really just a sad little mound of decomposed matter, almost non-biotic. And so I was sort of interested to hear everyone speaking this morning about how important plants are in terms of life and feeling connected with life. And I just want to remind myself that actually death is part of life. And so I met this little hornwort, and it was collected in 1889 in Isla Goggola by an Italian collector, Sommier. And so this little hornwort has been in the collection of the herbarium here in Sydney for all of that time. And I fell in love with this ugly little mound of decomposed matter and couldn't believe that this was actually the very first herbarium specimen to be photographed in this huge, vast process of trying to digitize the entire collection so that all of us can have access to this important data of plant specimen and related knowledge. So the hornwort for me is, they're so beautiful in nature, they're vibrant. These are non-vascular plants, they're mossy, they grow up in wetlands and marshes and swamps and creek beds. And I've seen quite a few hornworts lately in my bushwalks because of all the recent rain after the fires, after the droughts. And hornworts are so interesting because they have colonized the land for over 300 million years. And I'm really interested in collections of herbarium institutions for all kinds of reasons, and the idea that this hornwort came from afar in the 19th century, and yet we have all these interesting native hornworts here in Australia as well, and that relationship between our native collections and our introduced collections is a really complicated story to tell. The other thing that I really like about this little hornwort and coming to meet it and learning a little bit about it and having a look at its specimen sheet, which has, you know, all this kind of data information about the place that it was collected and the person who collected it, and a little bit of information about, you know, the different parts of the plant that was collected, is that there are a lot of problems with the specimen collections in herbarium. And I would love anyone in the audience to contact me if they're interested in the following, which is, how do we decolonize plants in these institutions or in these botanical gardens? How do we make sense of false information, racist information, sexist information? How do we come to terms with human mastery of plants? You know, this symposium today is so full of love and joy and the pleasure of getting to know plants and learning about plants and coming to understand ourselves through our relationships with plants. But I'm also very interested in, how do we re-sacralize plants? How do we re-enchant our relationships with plants through a decolonizing process? And can we do this through a process of fiction telling, through stories, to interrupt those dyad relationships, human nature, subject, object. So I just very quickly want to read out a spell that I wrote for my hornwort, and it is this: coolant of stings and comfort of swelling, green pendant swinging on a string of barbed envy. These pages are too heavy to turn alone. Help me find the spells to return to watery depths, where friendly liverworts comfort in change, single-celled spores and swimming biflagellates, plants that move from sea to shore, may return with ressentiment poison, clutching at their roots. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prue. And I hope we do return to those questions in the Q&A session about how to decolonize plants and resacralize our relationship to plants. So thank you for those provocations. Okay, our next speaker is Kat Gutierrez, who will speak on the toad lily. So Kat, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much, John, for that. Hi, everybody, and I'm tuning in from Oakland, California. It's really great to be here with all of you. So I'm Kat Gutierrez. I'm an assistant professor in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I have to first say that I'm just floored being part of such an expansive project. I have to open with that and thank Monica, John, Patricia, and Leah for inviting me and coordinating this symposium. So in my essay, I tell the story of the Tricertis imeldi, a species of toad lily, called so because of its characteristic spots, that was discovered and named in the Philippines in the early 1970s. This is the toad lily that you're looking at. The thing is, my dad was the one who discovered the lily and named it after this woman, Imelda Marcos, the infamous politician and wife of then dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Now, the story itself gets a little sticky. My dad was a botanist at the time, and he was assigned to visit one of the southernmost islands of the archipelago to investigate the plants of the Tasadai, a supposed cave-dwelling people that had been, quote unquote, discovered by the Philippine government and alleged to have had no contact with nearby peoples or tribes in the Philippines for conceivably eons. The Tasadai were a global sensation. The US Anthropology Association dedicated panels to their study. Movie stars visited the gentle Tasadai, as they had been called. And it wasn't until 1986, when the Marcos dictatorship was toppled, that it was revealed that the Tasadai were a hoax. They had been a group of farmers, given scanty clothing and paid to act as Stone Age cave dwellers. But in my essay, I ponder, can a plant be a hoax too? When I ask my dad about his experiences among the Tasadai, he speaks of the time in no clearer and unsullied terms. He had a job. That was to collect plants, their use and application. And the lily, one of dozens of plants collected, did have a use. It was locally called amut magiso, and its flowers were crushed by hand in order to release a sticky sap that could be used to catch amphibians. Could this information have been part of this grand hoax too, is what I wondered. And as plundering and as dangerous as the Marcoses were, they weren't free from insult and backhanded critique either. News broke of my dad's discovery of this enchanting, unique lily, claimed to be the only one of its kind, named in honor of the equally enchanting Imelda Marcos. Now, if any of you are familiar with contemporary Philippine history, Imelda was known for her exorbitant spending, her closets of shoes, and her eccentric manner. According to my father, some critics started to pit the toad lily against Imelda. Even if both were enchanting, their sticky sap could be used for less refined activities, like catching elusive frogs or superficially tantalizing international statesmen. Both she and the plant became the butt of jokes, and when the Tasadai discovery also proved to be a charade, it seemed that the toad lily also faded from the spotlight. But in 1986, and by then, my dad had already fled the Philippines for the United States. Prior to leaving, he had been questioned by the Philippine National Police for his medical botany research when copies of a book he had written on materia medica were found in the hands of armed units of the Communist Party of the Philippines. He left behind what had become a 3-decade career in plant research to work in cargo trucking in Los Angeles, where I was born. Only into graduate school did my dad become more vocal about his previous intellectual life. And curiously and interestingly, this intersected with my own interest in the history of science in the Philippines. His stories, like this one, began to animate my research projects, and it's stories like these that I seek to preserve, ones that can accommodate some genre bending of the historical, the scientific, and the personal. Now, the Tricertis imeldi has been reduced to a synonym of the Tricertis formosana. This particular toad lily and several from its genus are understood to only grow in Taiwan or in nearby East Asian territories. So this hasn't bothered my dad much. He admits that he named the lily in honor of Imelda to gain good graces with the government for his research. But this peculiar lily, one that may have skipped over an entire sea and an archipelago, was not identified anywhere else in the Philippines, nor known to grow in cultivation. That the lily landed in a secluded southern locale in the Philippines makes me ponder the possibility that perhaps the lily itself participated in the charade. I'm ever drawn to the idea that such an encounter of a lily growing outside of its expected zone and botanists chancing upon it can incite intellectual, political, and press frenzy. So seen from a very different vantage point then, even under the dictatorial spotlight, the lily had us in its grip. The lily's puzzling habitat, caught in the dictatorial spectacle of the 1970s Philippines, makes me wonder how much, in actuality, the plant hoaxed us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kat. Such a fascinating connection between the botanical history of the plant and your own family history. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Okay, our next speaker is Craig Holdridge, who will speak on the bloodroot. So please start when you're ready, Craig. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So I am in upstate New York, rural upstate New York. It is early springtime. And early springtime means that in the forests, the leaves are not yet out on the trees, and the forest floor is still quite bare. Very few plants have emerged. And tonight I want to talk, or this morning for you in Australia, I want to speak about one of the very first plants to emerge out of the ground in the early springtime. That is the plant called bloodroot. So imagine this browns and grays of the forest floor and the trunks of the trees. There is very little green. Life seems dormant, but here and there I can spot little grayish green bud-like forms peeking through the leaf litter. A day later, a white cap has grown up through the enwrapping gray-green. And on a following sunny afternoon, those caps have unfolded into brilliant white flowers with 8 petals. This plant is a radiant presence in the first stirrings of early spring in our area. Bloodroot flowering is a short-lived appearance. Its petals drop away after only a few days. As the forest greens with the emergence of the leaves of other plants, bloodroot's single leaf, which before enwrapped the flower, begins to unfold. Long stalked, it spreads its round and deeply lobed leaf. There's one flower and one leaf. It's a very simple and yet powerful gesture. As the leaf continues to grow, the small spear-like fruit at the end of the flower stalk begins to swell. In it, many seeds develop. By midsummer, the fruit splits open and releases glistening chestnut brown little seeds that fall to the ground and are often carried off by ants. The leaf, meanwhile, continues to grow into late summer. That's August in our area. It then comes to lie flat on the ground and it wilts. Nothing more of bloodroot is visible now for about 9 months, 8 months, 9 months. During the summer, hidden from view underground in the plant's rhizome, new buds have begun to form. And in each of those buds, a germinal flower and a germinal leaf. So here life is held back for those 8 months until the following spring. Bloodroot is in an extended dormant state, and it is full of potential. Finally, the longer and warmer days of the next spring call forth those progeny that developed last year in the summer, and bloodroot appears again. A plant is a being of transformation. It creates its own living substance out of light and air and water and soil. And think of all the colors and the scents and the tastes, and in every species, a unique array that the plant world is always creating. Over the course of the life cycle of a plant, it brings forth as expressions of its life its roots, its stems, its leaves, its flowers, its fruits, and its seeds. One part develops and another dies away. There's ongoing metamorphosis. Life moves through the plant, and a plant is always whole and yet never in one moment complete. It is a being in and through time. And its time is not a hectic time. It is expansive and it's gentle. As a human being, I can participate in this transforming life. I can learn to attend, to follow, and to inwardly engage in what plants are revealing in their ever-changing expressions. The plant can teach me how to live in transformation, how not to get stuck in my ways, and how to experience life as ongoing metamorphosis. And when I attend to plant communities, to the weaving of plant life within a particular environment, like the forest, then I can begin to experience that forest as a living symphony, as a dynamic integration of voices and tones. In this way, plants can help me to learn how to live in mutual relatedness and how to become more sensitive and responsive to the context I'm engaged in. Plants are a teacher of transformative life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. I hope we can speak more about that idea of the plant as a being of transformation and a being in and through time. Very important concept. So thank you. Thanks so much, Craig.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Joella Jacobs, who will speak on rose. So please go ahead, Joella, when you're ready.
Thank you, John. All right, just sharing my screen here quickly. I'm speaking to you from the original homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pasquayaki tribe, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial, and you might know it as Arizona. And I want to read you a short passage from my contribution to the Mind of Plants today. About the rose. The rose seems to be and not be everyone's favorite flower. Is that because she has become a cliche of her own beauty? Even for this project, she was listed as the first example, but picked last. Chosen because some of my favorite plants were taken by other contributors, and I became intrigued by her strongly felt absence. The rose's image of perfect beauty, a Valentine's Day specimen, has captured the human imagination, but that appears to stand in the way of recognizing her, for instance, in The Suffragette Who Demands Bread and Roses, or as Rosie the Riveter, a flowering genus of multifaceted variety that can prick back. So what is on the rose's mind? She speaks her mind and pricks back in a poem by arguably one of the most famous German authors, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The Little Rose on the Heath, written in 1771, was set to music by many composers. In the poem, Boy Meets Girl, a young man sees a beautiful red rose. He announces that he will pluck her, to which she responds with the threat of pricking him, so he will remember that never will I surrender. But the boy picks her despite her pricks, and she must needs surrender or suffer it, as the original German says. Written as a love poem to a woman, Goethe's words seem quite sinister in my 21st century context that is embroiled in the Me Too debate. Invoking the metaphor of defloration, this boy takes what he wants by force. While the rose's red color initially made me think of blushing love and passion, it evokes blood in the end, the blood of the pricked boy, but perhaps also the quote-unquote blood of the deflowered rose who is nearing death. This is not a love story, and what is odd is that her namesake of the Heath Road, or Rosa Canina, is actually a bushy, pale pink variety with a yellow center that can occasionally be almost white or a deeper hue of pink, but never red. In the poem, the little rose on the heath is described as red, being quite literally superseded by the image of a long-stemmed red rose, while her actual genus is the quote-unquote common rose. Perhaps no love poem can get away from the trope that roses are red. And because, or perhaps despite her commonness, this rose has become what the boy wants to see, what he wants to possess, a noble red queen of flowers. And in his attempt to attain this figment of his imagination, he kills the actual pink rose. So how do we come to see, to mind an individual rose for what she is, and what might be on the plant's mind? Goethe's poem, though an imaginary account of plant subjectivity, suggests to me that just like any other living being, this rose would like to live on unperturbed. In order to achieve this goal, she's ready to defend herself and equipped with a mechanism for it. Ultimately, it is no match for human hands, but it draws some blood and it leaves a mark. Even if the poem didn't put words in the rose's mouth, we would understand what she's communicating. Her picking tells the age-old story of humankind's assumed superiority, our violent approach to other living beings, and the force with which the human subordinates others. Yet this rose pricks back. If we allow for the metaphor of defloration in her picking, she has penetrated the assailant first in her pricking. Clearly, she has a mind of her own, concerned with perceiving and fighting off offenders, communicating her resistance and will for survival, and ultimately experiencing suffering on her way to death. A whole lot is going on in the simple act of picking a flower. Ultimately, the grandest achievement of the rose is her ability to capture the human imagination, to occupy our minds, even if it is in red disguise. In my research, I call this phytopoetics, the ability of plants to impact the human imagination to such an extent that it results in changes to human culture and society. It is a way for plants, phyto, to participate in the making, and the making is poiesis or poetics of culture, even though ideas that originally come from plants might take on a life of their own in the human cultural sphere and no longer resemble anything in nature in the end. In this way, the rose on the heath might make a case in support of gender equality and against the normalization of unwanted sexualized behaviors at some point in human history. At another, the same rose might have humans consider species equality and plant personhood. Through the poem, she has become immortal, even though it details her death. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Joella. And our next speaker is Megan Kaminsky on the big blue stem. So please start when you're ready, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. This has been just a gift to participate in. I'm here in Lawrence, Kansas, which is located in the traditional territories of the Kaw, Osage, and Sioux. I'm going to share poems today that I wrote in thinking with the big blue stem, other tall grasses, and plants in the Kansas prairie. Since I moved to Kansas, these plants have been my companions and teachers, instructing me in how to build good relationships with and within this place. I'm interested in thinking with how thinking with plants can expand our concepts of sentience, connectedness, embodiment, and compassion. Perhaps in thinking of fungal networks connecting trees to share information across the forest, the epigenetic inheritance of traits through subsequent generations of plants, and kin recognition amongst a variety of species. Or in this case, thinking with big blue stem and their web network of plant and the poems coming out of this project both attempt to enter into a world co-present with but other than our own, and to see vegetal inhabitants as a model of unconditional generosity in the face of vulnerability. So these are a little excerpt from my contribution to the book. By the teeth. Long walks do some good, but stillness in the wind pushing north mid-August is how I root deep into waking, dream out the meanderings of everyone else's day. The past is slack, and in it my hands spilled multitudinous, came flowering so many gifts, a new currency pink-petaled. On hot nights, wounds purchased by love in bug-filled backyards awaken anew. The ache we singed into each other, still answering like prayer taken hymnal. I don't know about patience, but I can hear the tall grasses each evening, holding the pose of the moon or you, a rupture I'm sore for mending. And the trains blow by 70 a day, limestone shaking through shale and chert. Each morning a different variation on what it is to swallow one's words, to hold sentences unextinguished without suffering injury. Grasshoppers abundant, and they know what I dare not, ceaselessly partaking in meal upon meal, green and brown enameled flanks laid thick across the tall grass fields. Each sunrise a revelation I sleep through, though cows come closer at sunset, bellow at the fading light, striations of want and loss and unsent messages drag across tracks and fences, taking us all together towards the horizon. This is the last one. I keep certain wounds open to honor the past, to display a thing that acknowledges its deficiency. One train yields to another to pass, while grasses twist in blown out light. Sometimes summer is all rain and overabundance, tomatoes bursting in the heat and a sorrow that can't find a way home. 20 years ago, they found a girl in that shed. A story never tires of cautionary telling. Late remainder of our intrinsic desire for shelter and shade, a soft place to rest each night. Were we all to wear those marks openly as flooding and time, river banks overflowing, and God knows what carried downstream? Were we to gather the shattered pieces whole? Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for reading your wonderful poetry. That so poignantly evokes the original flora of the Great Plains. We're excited to have you and Big Blue Stem in the book. Thank you. Our next speaker is Megan Jupatina, who will speak on the sunflower. So please start when you're ready, Megan.
Thanks, John. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to be here. So my name's Megan, and my piece was a collaboration between myself, my graduate supervisor, James F. Cahill Jr., and Helianthus annis, the common sunflower. So at the time I was writing the piece, I was a graduate student studying plant behavior, and I was using sunflower to ask questions about how sunflowers forage for nutrients and how the social environment and their interactions with other plants affects the decisions that they make. And so when I told people that I studied sunflower behavior, it didn't really click with people the way I think it would have if I had told them I studied animal behavior. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, because we don't really tend to describe plants as behaving. So in our piece, we wanted to kind of address different ways of describing and thinking about plants, and think about how we could move towards an understanding and a way of describing plants that is more behavioral, and moving away from descriptions of plants that are more passive or static. And one approach we considered taking was to create an ethogram for a sunflower. So an ethogram is a tool that's used a lot in the behavioral sciences, and it's basically just a list of all the behaviors known in a species. And it's used a lot in animal behavior, and it allows you to create this dictionary that you can use to understand larger patterns of behavior in animals. And so we started to compile an ethogram for sunflower based on the literature and our own experience with it, to create a more behavioral way of describing the plants. So we built it around these fundamental categories in a sunflower's life, such as finding habitat, finding food, finding mates, and defending itself. And so our initial drafts were a little dry because an ethogram is really just a list of behaviors, known behaviors in a species. So in collaboration with the editors, we moved towards a version of the piece that was more a reflection on what an ethogram for sunflower would look like if we were better able to perceive behavior in plants. So because we're animals, we can kind of relate to and understand what animals are doing a little bit better than we can for plants. And ethograms can even be constructed just by observing an animal with a pen and paper. Whereas with plants like sunflowers, it's a little bit more complicated because so much of what they do is outside of our perceptive abilities as mobile organisms ourselves. So a sunflower might be foraging and looking for food, but it's doing it through these growth responses that are a lot slower than what we're used to or what we're able to perceive. And a sunflower might communicate with other sunflowers or communicate with other species, but it's doing it through these chemical signals that we're not able to perceive. So if we had an ethogram for Helianthus, if we had the ability to look at all of these behaviors and then to observe them in the species, how would it change the way that we perceive plant life? And would we be able to perceive new patterns? For example, would we start noticing not just the difference between species of plants, but individuals within a species? Would we notice that some sunflowers are more aggressive and bold and some are more shy? Would we notice that there's differences between populations of sunflower in their behavior that could be either genetic or cultural, passed down? Would we talk about plants and would we talk about sunflowers differently and appreciate them differently? So these questions and ideas are why it's key to keep working to understand plant behavior, even though it can be challenging, because behavioral understanding is a key part of our approach to understanding plants in general. And when we work towards understanding plants from a place of love and curiosity, it becomes really wonderful that there's so many mysteries to uncover in even the familiar and ubiquitous sunflower. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. It's amazing how the science is transforming how we understand plants and how that's affecting all other areas of culture. So it's a really exciting moment, and thank you for sharing your research. Our next speaker is Andre Paris, who will speak on the bean. So thank you, Andre.
Hello, thank you. I'm speaking from the island of Santa Catarina in Brazil, and I have written something because I'm not very good at improvising in English. So we chose to write about the beans, the humble beans, because in our lab in Brazil, coincidentally, we work with one of the most important plants in Brazilian culture, although many people don't realize this. Besides, as we tell in our contribution, beans are probably the first plant many Brazilians ever plant. They are easy to find, have a large seed, and grow with ease. They are perfect plants for children to watch the beauty and mystery of plant development. During my colleagues' and mine research, we studied the electrical activity of beans while interacting with their environment. Hence, with the electrophysiological experiments, we observed at first hand the interaction of these plants with the world through microvariations of electrical potential within their soft stems. Indirectly, we observed the dance of ions that make them alive and connected with the environment, perceiving and interacting with it. And of course, we could not but marvel at the deep and ancient similarities between them and ourselves. All the living systems depend upon ions in different concentrations and in their coordinated movement throughout the body to keep them alive. All the wonderful richness of the biosphere of Gaia rely on the same biochemical principles, and writing a contribution made me realize and amaze with this remarkable truth. Despite the undeniable differences among all the life forms that populate and populated this planet, we all have similar souls. This is a crucial discovery. As we all know, the world is changing. The earth is heating, the environment degrading, and many societies and peoples being silenced. Reversing climate change and environmental destruction, simultaneously creating a new and fair society for everyone, is the biggest task we as humanity have today. Every day, more and more minds join this effort because, fortunately, humanity is finally realizing that we cannot elude this mission anymore. But this awareness poses us a question: how to achieve the change in the minds and hearts of all humans to propel this shift in our course? Often, I talk about this with my friends, people young like me and with the same will of assuming the challenge of our century for the planet we are inheriting. We all have the same question. We feel that regardless of the importance of, let's say, to protest, reduce meat consumption, and avoid a consumerist way of life, something is missing yet. This all is not enough to achieve the change we need in humankind. How to do it then? The change we need begins with a rational acknowledgement, but must sit within the heart, not the brain. We need an emotional relationship with the earth, not just a rational one. And we all are in search of a really effective way to transform the relationship of humans with the planet. I have friends trying this through art and architecture, others through education, others still through biotechnology. On my side, now coming back to the beans, I believe that the awareness that plants have minds is a door through which we will understand that every living being possesses the same bioelectrical soul, and are cognitive and intelligent, and are agents in a living and fickle world, not mere objects. In my opinion, acknowledging that they all have their own minds will contribute enormously to the shift in their hearts that we talk about. Only when we rediscover the plants and other livings as our peers and feel it deep in our souls, we will finally reach the effective change. This is why I praise initiatives like the Mind of Plants book and symposium. I'm sure that Monica, John, and Patricia, just like all the artists, poets, scientists, scholars, and writers here gathered, have the same feeling and will to achieve a form and content so as to drive this necessary and beautiful change. Thank you, Monica, thank you, John, and thank you, Patricia, for the invitation in joining this project. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andre. Hopefully we can discuss this idea of plant consciousness transforming global consciousness. Very important
I hope
to
so.
bear those ideas in mind. Okay, our final speaker of the session is Stephen White, and I will share Stephen's PowerPoint. And once I do that, feel free to start. Let's see.
Great, thanks so much, John. So I've decided that I want my mortal remains. We could look at the first one, the first image here. This is the very tree. I've decided that I want my mortal remains to nourish the roots of my favorite Seba trees on our ancestral family farm in Tilica, Nicaragua, called Finca Santa Ana, and in front of my home in San Jerónimo, on the outskirts of the great Nicaraguan city of letters and higher education, León. It would seem that once I am no longer on what Norman MacLean calls the oxygen side of Earth's crust, it would be the perfect opportunity to really concentrate in darkness for a very, very long time, to learn the Seba's language just by paying attention to its roots spreading through me and then rising high into its towering crown on a roller coaster of water and photosynthesis in its leaves shaped like the hands I once had. Let's take a look at the next image, John. A new project here has allowed me to get closer than ever to the Sebas I've lived with most intimately on a level where the infinitely small approaches the infinitely vast. Jill Flughaber, a microscopy specialist from the biology department at St. Lawrence University, and I have been working over the last 5 years on microcosms, a homage to sacred plants of the Americas. There's a link in my bio in the presenter's material to a gallery of these images. So if you look at this image, you can easily see, you can appreciate the ovoid apertures of the stomata. Then, with a slight push into the imagination of this hitherto unperceived proximity, perhaps it is not inconceivable to begin to share vital resources with this digital Seba and consider how it would be to breathe with the plant itself. Let's take a look at the next image. Also of the Seba seen through the confocal microscope. And then the last image. This is the seed pod of the Seba. And I recall once seeing photographs of magnifications of the silky seeds of the Seba, each implausibly tiny seed for such a great tree attached to a column of enclosed air. So yes, of course, the seeds could indeed fly. And if the seeds were to fall in the calm or roiled waters of Nicaragua's great internal freshwater sea, Lake Cocibolca, they would continue their journey, floating on and on until they reached a distant shore to germinate in the deathless desire of all plants. And we can end the screen share here, John. Certain perceptive children are more aware than adults that the Seba is a home for many different creatures. It is a refuge for iguanas and squirrels, a giant living space with myriad secret nests. The Seba is also where the chichicastes live, the phosphorescent green caterpillars whose poisonous hairs resemble a forest that is being carried along as it moves. The chichicaste is highly toxic and especially dangerous for children. The sting produces a serious fever. And according to my wife, Estela Calderon, who was the first speaker on this panel, she is Nicaraguan and also a contributor to the book, The Mind of the Plants. The chichicaste also produces revelatory dreams. Her close encounter with the chichicaste when she was 7 years old left her with the indelible impression that these caterpillars are the caretakers of the Seba and that the tree communicates by means of this poisonous intermediary. The caterpillar's hairs in the shape of undulating upright trees even resemble a Seba's leaves, which is the chichicaste's preferred food. Decades later, Estela still remembers the revelation produced by the caterpillar's venom. After her feverish state, she found that she could clearly distinguish the caterpillars from the leaves, where they were perfectly green and camouflaged. The chichicastes only became visible to her child's eyes for the first time after she was poisoned by them. She also remembers how the caterpillars are later transformed into beautiful iridescent moths with the first rains in May. What then is one to make of these caterpillars tracing what Dale Pendle has described as the poison path? Living high among the branches of the Seba and carrying their own portable miniature psychoactive forest on their bodies. What do I think about when I am close to the Seba and even touching the sharp thorns in the trunk that protect its future, meditating in the place where I will finally rest? The Seba receives the newborn just as its root are a kind of sacred cup that accumulates water. The sound of the Seba is always changing as it creaks and sways in hurricanes and gentle rains as well. Each branch in its perfect mind understands exactly how it will grow and shape the sky. This tree already knows the aesthetics of its future anatomy. The Seba possesses an emotional complexity, asserting its importance, aware that it was not born to give the world mangoes or plantains. The Seba is certain who it is. It senses itself a recipient of so much vegetal history and consciousness. And it knows how to occupy a space completely, dominating it, steadfast in its own rootedness in this particular ecosystem. Its thought collaborates as a supreme spatial guardian and understands this responsibility. We human beings have far too many questions and we never seem to find enough answers. Not so of the Seba. Like all trees, it has no lack of memory in its wisdom, and this is by no means an egotistical tree. The Seba lives to strengthen fertility. In order to grow, it proudly sends out its sharp spines on its trunk to keep enemy iguanas from climbing to eat its new growth. It is responsible for its actions and their consequences. It knows itself with utter confidence. The Seba is ceremonial by nature. It is far more than everything that surrounds it. The omniscient Seba sees everything and more. It protects humanity's plants and is always vigilant of the other trees. The chichitotes, the orioles, make their hanging nests high in the Seba, far from the danger of reptiles that cannot pass its barrier of formidable thorns. In preserving itself, the Seba protects other species. It is a space that is too high and too dangerous for most. These are the things I contemplate in the presence of the Seba. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And you've transformed the way that I see the Seba when I do see it here in Indonesia and elsewhere. I'll always think of you. So thanks so much for that. Those are the speakers for this session. Just a few points. Actually, I invite everyone to open their cameras now, all the presenters. And a few points I'd just like to remind our participants of. The first is the photo feed. You are welcome to upload photos at the top right of the live stream console. You can click photo feed and then upload images of plants there. And secondly, some of our speakers have contributed short recordings to the Mind of Plants website. So if you're interested in following up, see www.themindofplants.com and then click on the videos to see some other short videos of what you've seen today. Okay, so I'd like to get into our Q&A, and we have a number of questions already. Let's backtrack. Okay, so the first is for Prue, and the question is, what is the relationship between decolonizing the individual's soma and subjectivity and decolonizing the botanical record?
Yes, it's a really good question. And these are concepts that I'm only just starting to grapple with, but maybe I can answer by sharing some information that the Sydney Herbarium, which is called the National Herbarium of New South Wales, they are just starting to become quite interested in this kind of reconciliation process with First Nations people here in Australia. And what they're quite interested in starting to do in all aspects of their work is tri-naming. So in terms of the second half of that question, the idea of having the Latin name, the common name, and the First Nations name in all of their interpretation is what they're thinking of. In terms of the more kind of philosophical concept of like the subjectivity, the performativity of plants in terms of a decolonizing context, I've given this some thought, not enough yet, and I would love to hear from anyone who has given this more thought than I have. But recently, I'm part of this group called the Dirt Witches, which is a group of more than 60 environmental activist women. And we recently reconstructed or rewilded this Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub in the city, the CBD here in Sydney. And I really struggled with this for that very reason of, are we just kind of contributing more colonial projects here? It was an artwork, a laneways artwork, and we were given money from the City of Sydney to do it, which again was problematic because we're supposed to be a protest group. And after some time, because this Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub is actually critically endangered here in Australia, there used to be 5,000 hectares, there's only 120 hectares left. So we rewilded this space with the entire scrub. So it's not just a Banksia, it's like 50 species of Banksia related scrub. And I realized that the reason the public was so interested in it is that maybe it ties into this idea of sympathetic magic, which is a MGTOWSIC idea where you make a copy, you mimic the original, and by making a copy, it doesn't take away from the original, it creates affect for the original. So it starts this kind of relationship between the copy and the original. So or what that means in terms of decolonizing the subjectivity of plants themselves is for me about being using arts and narrative as a playful and kind of loving technique and methodology to raise awareness for the original.
Thank you. A very good response to a quite difficult, challenging question. So thank you, Prue. Next question is for all of our presenters. And it is, how do we decolonize our approach to rewilding, and how we reconcile giving back land to plants when there are still unceded territories around the world? So I'll read that once again. How do we decolonize our approach to rewilding, and how do we reconcile giving land back to plants when there are still unceded territories around the world? Anyone?
Shall I just jump in and just to say one
Please.
thing, just since there's silence, awkward silence, is that I actually did ask the director of our herbarium here in Sydney about the idea of repatriation of plant specimens, that have been distributed or taken away by German, French, British botanists during the beginning of our colonization. And the interesting thing that they said was that they don't need that kind of repatriation of plants because they're just sent copies overseas. So, we have in our Sydney collection 24,000 species of plants in the collection, and 89% of them are nowhere else in the world. So just in terms of this, that's not so much about giving land back to plants, but it is, and it's kind of an interesting point about, the distribution of plant specimens in a colonial context, and how do we decolonize them? Well, maybe we don't need that repatriation in terms of plants, may not be quite so critical.
Thank you, Prue. Yeah.
There are also projects here in Tucson. One is called Native Seeds, where there are efforts to replant plants that are original to this region, and I mean, it's an interesting challenge that I could imagine is similar in Australia too, with watering and so forth. One of the reasons why I was my decision to talk about the rose was so fraught was because it is an invasive species that follows us everywhere, right? That we see planted everywhere, in front of every airport, in front of every hotel, that kind of context. And so I think in here, it's often also a debate over aesthetics. That is an interesting one. What do we want to see? What do we see as real plants and so forth? Because a lot of what grows in the desert here is, I mean, they're beautiful cacti, but there's also a lot of shrubbery that at first glance might look half dead, right? So I think there's also a question, I was really struck by what Andre said about capturing our hearts, or capturing our imagination, or capturing our maybe a sense of empathy too, to actually see plants that are not sort of the ones that maybe are as beautiful as that lily, for instance, that reminds me of a beautiful woman, or that or rose and so forth. So I think there is, since there were also questions in the chat that I saw about the idea of anthropomorphism, is it ethical even? What do we do with the imagination? I think part of what plants do such a great job with is capturing our attention, right, in one way or another, and that to me is a fascinating aspect to this question. Who captures our attention, and how do we then respond?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joella. That does lead us nicely into the next question, which is the push into imagination ethical or not? I mean, we can't even speak of nouns of those, or can we? Like the noun personality. And this person directed the question to Steve, but I believe it's relevant to all of us. So any responses to that? The ethics of imagination and plants.
it's a danger. Yeah,
Oh,
go
go
ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I can talk a little bit about it from maybe the historian's perspective. I'm playing with this idea of kind of the agentic role of plants in history, specifically in the Philippines. And I get confronted with this. We're plants making the decisions, right, and pulling the strings for how things played out on the Philippines stage, right? What are the ethical considerations for even proposing something like that? I think as a historian, I'm really just trying to push an understanding of how maybe a plant could be a little bit more of a collaborator in history than what we typically write of them, which is either as a utilitarian object or something that's quite passive and in the backdrop of history and how history plays out. And so I think imagination plays into that when we recognize perhaps this collaboration at play. And yeah, when plants are acting perhaps more strangely than we ever perceive, what else is going on that's perhaps not completely in our agentic control? And that's where I think, again, we can sort of tiptoe through these questions of ethics, but then open up the possibility for a new kind of historical writing.
If I could just add one thing here, John. I know there's at least one person listening. I saw that there was someone who sent a message in the chat from Pucallpa, Peru. And I've been to Pucallpa. A friend of mine who lives there reminded me that there is a giant Seba in the downtown area of Pucallpa. But for the people who live there, they associate it with a very sad time in the history of their city, which is when the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path terrorists had taken over the region, and they used the Seba tree in the downtown area of Pucallpa to execute prisoners. So that now the imagination, the sense of ethics in the city of Pucallpa is deeply influenced by the Seba tree as a site of history, of resistance, of tragedy. And I think these kinds of things have to enter into our consideration as we write and think about plants. Again, you often see photographs of this treaty was signed under the historic tree in this year by forces to end a war or something like this. I mean, trees are always associated with these historical events often. That's the only thing I would add to answer that question.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah. It does tie into the next question, which has to do with recent scholarship on plant personhood. And there's been some books written on the subject of plants as persons, and plant subjectivity is something that's debated. So the question is about the problem and promise of anthropomorphism. How else might we imagine plants as persons or as communities?
I can talk about this a little bit. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about. And I guess this ties in a little bit with the question about imagination. I mean, our sentience, our embodiment is so different from plants. So there's a way in which we can I think it's our responsibility to use our imaginative capacities, our intuitive capacities, our observational capacities to try to, as much as possible, think with plants and be with plants and make that effort, right, to understand and to open space. But at the same time, we are going to always be eating plants. So there's this problem with, I mean, unless there's someone has other ideas, there's also this problem with thinking about plants as persons, right? Or at least in the ethical category where we put other human beings. So I think for me, and I guess this is maybe why I like being a poet, it's this dance, right? It's this holding simultaneously these two ideas that are in conflict with each other. But I think that grappling is what we need to be doing if we're going to live in ethical good relations with plants, I guess. So maybe not an answer, but a suggestion that we keep we keep in those contradictions.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah.
Maybe I could chime in here. Is that all right, John?
Definitely. Thanks.
Still a moment.
Thanks,
yeah. So for me, it's a bit of the question of trying to find what are the qualities of plantness that are so special that actually also make them different from us and different from animals, in the sense of, I always have this feeling when I'm working with plants and studying plants, in contrast when I'm studying animals and working with animals, that the plants, if we want to speak of their intelligence, is what connects them to the larger world. They're, in the best sense of the word, eccentric. They're not centered creatures in the way that we are. That's my feeling. That's not only a feeling. I think there's some truth in that, and that then I sometimes worry that we feel like the only way we can come to to protect and to honor and to cherish plants is to make them more human. And I think that's really not what we need to do. We need to use all our human capacities in order to find our way into the plantness of the plant, of these amazing creatures that, like no others on earth, can create living substance out of a very tenuous environment of water and air. And so to really come to an understanding of these special living characteristics of these beings is what, for me, is important, to use my human capacities to cherish, in a sense, their otherness. It doesn't mean I'm not connected with them as living beings, but to see they're a different way of being in the world without which I could not exist and all animal creatures could not exist. Yeah, so that just is one perspective.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah. Any other reflections on plant personhood, subjectivity? The question I'd like to pose is, it's an interesting time to be interested in plants, right? There's the science of plant cognition and neurobotany and so forth that's transforming traditional notions of plants as just kind of acted upon. So how do we engage imaginatively as writers, poets, philosophers, et cetera, with that science? Or does that science in some way interact with our own approaches as writers, philosophers, and so forth? Right? How do you approach that in your own work? How do you, or don't you? That's the question.
Can I add the category of teachers too?
Oh, definitely, please.
The list. I think that is where I find it most exciting. I mean, thinking about this and talking about this with colleagues is great, but I think even more fascinating is talking about this with students who have never thought about plants that way. And I think those are some of the most rewarding conversations to have these moments when someone realizes that there isn't just a passive thing there, right? That this is a living being with a whole range of capabilities and an otherness or alterity that is really fascinating, and forms of being that and behaviors that are that sort of maybe unsettle us a little bit out and sort of move us for a second outside of our anthropocentric worldview, right? Because that I think is the power of some of those anthropomorphic descriptions, right? And whether we think about the amount of time that plants have been around that we haven't witnessed, just to pick up on history, or whether we think about the future and who will survive us, I think both of these are just great moments to think through with others.
Thanks, Joella. Yes, anyone? just read through some of the comments we've been getting, and that might spur some more responses. So one participant has written the verb for an ethical noun is éthiser. So we could call the language of ethical promises and problems, even retroactively though, a problem of the éthiser. It's like not turning around anything, but still reconciling a compassion for something or some place. So plants and compassion and ethics is an important topic. We have a comment on neurolinguistics. Another comment, we could carry the decolonizing repatriation question forward into other sessions. Yes, definitely. That will go through all the sessions today. So fascinating conversation, especially thoughts on the inherent beauty aesthetics attributed to plants, vegetation. It reminds me of Rebecca Giggs, who I understand is an Australian poet, I believe, recent writing on fathoms, which touched on adjacent notions of animal charisma. Yeah, the idea of plant charisma is also another interesting one. Animal charisma, which species we deem as being valued, spared from decline as beautiful or ugly, etc. Yeah. A comment for Prue, your recognition of the tensions around applying white Western remedies as a form of reconciliation is very insightful. As we First Nations say, nothing about us without us. Projects on our behalf are admirable, but also are limited by assumptions that we have nothing to contribute. I would encourage you to reach out to the traditional custodians of our country. Our community worked with the Queensland Herbarium to publish a reference text that incorporates our language, names, and medicinal uses of flora of the Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island people, and there's a link there. And another comment, I would tread lightly on the discussion of planty persons and ethics, as many world indigenous and traditional cultures recognize the personhood of plants, which science is easing into. I work as an archaeologist in Northern Australia, where traditional ecological knowledge and ancestral stories detail the agency and personhood of many plants and the shared ancestries of humans, animals, and plants together. That's from Emily Cray. Another comment, the concept of rewilding is based on a Western perception of wildness, as Deborah Bird Rose has elegantly written about. Okay, or if there's any last comments, please, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, if not, I want to thank you for yeah, Joella.
I was just going to say, great points. I mean, it's just so great to hear from people all over the world on these important questions.
I agree. It's this path that we're led down with plants is taking us into questions that need to be asked, isn't it? So I'd like to thank all of our wonderful participants, our presenters, for just really fabulous, passionate, informed, poetic, imaginative, and dedicated presentations on your plant loves. We're all plant people. We're unsure where the plant ends and the human begins, right? We've become hybrid in our love for plants. So it's been great sharing this session with you. And our next session, just to advertise that, will begin at past. And the topic there is artistic and poetic plants and humans, definitely continuing on this thread with imagination and all the other important themes that came up during this session. So thanks, everyone. Hope to see you later on, and take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye, John.